Extra second. All right, welcome everyone to Frank Analysis. I'm your host Franco. I'm joined today again by Robert Inlakesh, returning to the show for the second time. He's a reporter and journalist from The Last American Vagabond, and he also has a documentary series on his channel called Robert Inlakesh called The Steal of the Century. You guys should definitely check that out. I recommended that to you all. I shared it also to my channel. Robert, how are you doing today? I know these times are really troubling for you since this is personal for you. I know that you've had a lack of sleep. I thank you very much for coming on the show so that you can inform my audience.
No, thank you very much for having me on here. And also have to tag in there that I work for Press TV and
Yeah.
Pod News as well on the side there too. So I had to tag that in. But no, it's been quite horrible over the past few days. And so I'm really pleased to get on here and talk more and reach your audience.
So what's your summary about what's happening in Jerusalem and Gaza right now?
Well, of course, this dates back a long time. I mean, you could
Mm-hmm.
start the timeline, of course, with the illegal occupation. You could go back to the ethnic cleansing, but for the sake of time, I think the best summary of this is that Israel started to place restrictions upon Palestinian worshippers at the beginning of Ramadan. It also, with its occupation police forces, Israel in Jerusalem began to attack Palestinians after they protested due to restrictions placed around the old city of Jerusalem, and specifically for Palestinians on Ramadan getting into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site to Muslims. Then from there, these protests gathered, they got bigger. The issue of the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, which is a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, which Israel is currently working on ethnically cleansing up to 550 people from their homes so illegal Israeli settlers can come and take those homes, became prominent. And of course, protests erupted around the scene, and the Israeli riot forces came in and attacked many of these protesters. And so we saw that this situation began escalating at that point. There were then Palestinians who went out. There was one Palestinian who went and slapped an Israeli in the face on public transport, posted this video online on TikTok, and people thought it was funny. And then Israelis reacted by that. Israeli Jewish people reacted to that, and specifically the settlers here in this case. We have to differentiate here. The extremist settlers began their own TikTok challenge where they would go and attack Palestinians. So Palestinians started attacking them back as well. This sort of escalated tensions inside of the city. The occupation forces during that time were attacking Palestinians and injuring hundreds of Palestinians. These tensions really boiled at this time. Then about 2 weeks ago from now, so roughly halfway through Ramadan, an extremist mob, which has been described by the likes of Dan Cohen as a lynch mob, a modern day lynch mob, took to the streets of Jerusalem and attempted to enter the old city where Palestinian homes are through the Damascus Gate area, chanting death to Arabs and that they should burn down the villages of Arabs, right? So Palestinians. Palestinians came to confront them, to stop them from doing this. The Israeli occupation forces there attacked Palestinians and injured hundreds of Palestinians. And also around the area of Sheikh Jarrah as well, they did the same on that night. And so that sort of really escalated the situation. And the following day, after threats to the Israeli forces that there would be a response, armed factions in the Gaza Strip fired 30 sort of makeshift rockets, right? And that came from the Abu Ali Mustafa brigades, which is the armed wing of the PFLP, or at least it was claimed by them. During this time, the Israelis continued to escalate and escalate and escalate. The leadership of the armed factions that convened in what's called the Joint Room for the Resistance factions announced that if these crimes continue, There will be a big response, a crushing blow, and also that on the 28th day of Ramadan, which was this Monday behind us, if the settler march, which was planned to breach the Al-Aqsa Mosque, was to go ahead, then there would be a tough response from the armed factions. So I'm explaining all of this because the mainstream press doesn't want to talk about any of this because it exposes the reality of what Netanyahu and the Israeli government could have done to de-escalate tensions. And it knew there was going to be an armed response from the Gaza Strip in response to this. During this time, Palestinians throughout the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, inside of Israel itself, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and in Jerusalem, there were protests in solidarity with Jerusalem. They knew this was boiling up, but Israel backed the extremist settlers, the Israeli government backed the extremist settlers, and then just before that settler march was planned on the Friday last week, Israeli occupation forces, around 200 of them, entered into the Al-Aqsa Mosque site and fired tear gas and rubber bullets and smashed into and assaulted hundreds of Palestinian worshippers in the third holiest site in the religion of Islam. And they went in and they smashed the windows of the mosques at the site. They fired in and desecrated a medical facility at the compound. And of course, they injured hundreds of people there at the time, many of which were hospitalized. They fired tear gas inside of the mosques. They attacked men, women, children, the elderly, you name it. They attacked them. And in response, Palestinians were throwing stones, right? This really, really heated things up. And from this point, the armed groups in Gaza also said that, look, if you're going to do anything more than this, you're going to continue this, we are going to deliver the biggest blow we can possibly deliver to you. Israel knew this was coming. On Monday, the attacks happened again. The occupation forces stormed Al-Aqsa Mosque again in what was described as clashes. These weren't clashes. These were armed, fully trained, right, well-protected in protective gear, Israeli occupation police forces entering a holy site and attacking Palestinians during their holy month. This is akin to, for instance, the Vatican being invaded by a foreign force on Christmas, and they go in and they start shooting people. That's what that's like. And when this happened on Monday, and the escalation occurred inside of Jerusalem and also in the area of Sheikh Jarrah and surrounding areas, all up, 550 people are injured. 333 of them, approximately, according to local statistics, were hospitalized. Palestinians inside of the city. About 20 Israeli police were injured to some extent, but not seriously, to my knowledge. Then what had happened is the armed groups had given Israel the deadline of 6 p.m. local time to withdraw from the Al-Aqsa Mosque, to stop the settler march, these extremist settlers, the racist ones who were marching just 2 weeks below from entering the Al-Aqsa compound, and to stop its assaults on Sheikh Jarrah. Israel didn't do this. And by 6 o'clock, rockets were fired. No Israelis were killed in the initial rocket fire, none of them. However, they did reveal that they could hit different areas and more precise than they could before with these rockets that they used, the armed factions in Gaza. Israel decided then that what it would do is bomb the Gaza Strip, and in the period of around 24 hours, killed 20 innocent people. 9 of them were children, and no dead Israelis at that point. The Palestinian people then threw out the country. So the Palestinian people, citizens of Israel, the Palestinians in West Bank, the Palestinians in Jerusalem, and the Palestinian people and the armed factions in Gaza all went flat out on the offensive and rose up into what is, and people don't want to call it this, and it has been declared by some of the armed factions and some of the political parties, Palestinian political parties, an intifada. Mm-hmm. And this time the Palestinians are unified. They're fighting back. They have better weapons. They have revealed these weapons. They have killed many Israeli soldiers. The Israeli forces are covering many of the deaths up of their soldiers. They've also hit Israelis inside of Israel as well, to the extent I believe 7 of them or 6 of them have been killed. And up until this point right now where we're speaking, and this is going to, by the time this live stream is done, it's going to be more 107 Palestinians have been massacred in the Gaza Strip, around 30 children, right? And 29 women. Okay. The large majority of these are civilians, provably civilians. Israel can see what it is targeting with precision weapons. It knows it's targeting civilians. It has brought down residential buildings. People close to me have had to flee their homes, right? And their entire neighborhoods have been decimated, absolutely wiped off the face of the earth. Israel is targeting civilian infrastructures, schools, mosques, power lines, police stations, the roads. They are trying to destroy the Gaza Strip. That's what they're doing because they're mad that finally the Palestinian people are fighting back against occupation, and it's actually working to an extent this time. So that's what's been happening in the occupied territories. And you won't hear this on mainstream media. And sorry, this was a long sort of explanation of what's happened, longer than I intended originally, but it's very, very key. It's very vital.
No, thank you for detailing that. Yeah, you've been tracking this for a long time. And what the mainstream media doesn't realize this, and everybody else who's both siding this or giving more or feeling more bad for the Israelis, is that this has been building up for decades and decades and decades. And it's like the bully getting mad that the person that they're bullying is standing up for themselves. And I'm going to reiterate this: under international law, like, the Palestinians have a right to stand up to their oppressors, to the people that are trying to colonize them. So since you've been tracking this for a long time, you saw this coming, right? You're calling this a third intifada?
Mm-hmm. That's what I believe it is. It's a third intifada, and it can be very much described as such. And it's from all of the people of Palestine. They're all fighting back. And this is what happens when your back is against the wall, when you are living under a brutal military occupation, right, since 1967. And people forget this, but the Palestinian citizens of Israel lived under a brutal military occupation, right, military law, between 1948 to 1966. People forget this. They're discriminated against, and according to Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem, they live in an apartheid system too. Okay, and there were movements as well earlier in the year against police violence against them, and also the police not managing or handling violence in their communities. And so the people who have had their back pushed up against the wall had had enough. This provocative act as well, it's not just on Muslims, right? This is on Christians as well. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre during Orthodox Christian Easter was also, the worshippers were also punched in the face, right, and assaulted by Israeli forces during Orthodox Easter. So this is not a thing about religion, but people were collectively outraged at what was happening in Jerusalem, the dispossession of homes, the desecration of a holy site, and the outright disrespect. And they drew a red line, and they're rising up now against it. And that's what we're seeing.
Yeah. Like you said, I've been seeing these videos that you've been showing on your channel, or that Richard Medhurst has been showing, of people's homes getting bulldozed. Like, that's been going on for such a long time. And like, they just have had it, these people. And then they don't have as much tech. They don't have the backing that these Western powers, the US, the UK, have, that they're giving to Israelis. So I just want to give some people some imagery of what's going on here. I'm gonna show some of the video clips that you've been sharing from your Twitter feed. So let me pull this up for everybody so they can see, and adjust the audio so that you can hear it as well. Just adjusting the audio real quick. So you posted this 9 hours ago. Israeli airstrikes have killed 84 Palestinians, including 17 children, 7 women, and around 400 have been injured. I imagine that number has gone up since 9 hours ago. Thousands of homes struck, destroyed, and tens of thousands made to flee or made homeless. So these are war crimes committed on Eid, like you said, a very sacred holiday for Muslims, against civilians. So then here's another one. It says breaking occupation forces in East Jerusalem caught on film brutally assaulting a Palestinian man. He was a paramedic, according to local media, and this attack on an unarmed medical worker is a crime in violation of international law. Will this be on Western media? I haven't seen it covered on Western media, other than in And again, I just want to remind people how the police forces in Israel, just like how we talked yesterday about Colombia and how those police forces are armed by the U.S., those are armed and militarized by the U.S. and its Western allies. And even some of the U.S. police forces go to Israel to receive training. So here's another video. Airstrikes continue right now. Tens of thousands have fled their homes, thousands of homes destroyed. Adding on to all the homes that have been destroyed via bulldozers and replaced so that Israelis can live there. Yeah, Robert, so you want to add some commentary to these video clips?
Well, in terms of the bombardment clips, the Israel is targeting civilian infrastructure, like I said, and it's very clear. It's a message, like in the past, to the Palestinian people that you will all be collectively punished if any of you fight back. And honestly, at this time, Palestinians are actually really able to fight back, and it's the first time we've really seen them have this ability to fight back. Now, I don't want to misconstrue this. Palestinians don't have the abilities of the Israeli military, one of the strongest in terms of its arming on the planet. It doesn't have that, but it has the means to wage guerrilla warfare against the occupier, and it's doing so. And it's had a lot of successes so far. And now Israel is threatening to perhaps wage a ground invasion. Now, the reason why this is incredibly dangerous is for a few different reasons. Number one is when Israel wages a ground invasion, the Israeli military is probably one of the most, if not the most, cowardly military on the planet that exists, in that they do not want, they will kill as many civilians as it takes in order to protect a single soldier. Okay. And clear out everything, probably on par with the United States, right? In terms of the way the military works, but they're probably even worse in terms of a military casualty is a lot bigger deal inside of Israel. It's a huge deal, probably more than the civilians. It hurts the morale. So when they come into Gaza, they level everything, absolutely everything in their path. They will fire on anything that moves. It doesn't matter whether they're a civilian or a militant. And they will kill as many as it takes to keep themselves clear. So when they go in, if they go in, that is part of what will happen. The other part is the armed resistance on the ground this time is a lot better equipped and trained. And so they're going to kill quite a few Israelis. And if they kill a lot of Israelis and they kidnap some Israeli soldiers, then that will mean that they will bring in a tremendous amount of firepower. Israel needs to give itself the cover to its own population that it's doing something by giving the statistics of the dead, right? And the statistics of the dead, if we say 107 have been killed, like is the case now, I'm sure they're still pulling bodies out of the rubble, right? And bombing civilian homes, and it's ongoing right now. And the death toll is going to rise. To them, the reporting, a lot of it, the way they say, oh, yeah, the majority of them were terrorists, when clearly they're not, but the majority of them will be reported like they're terrorists that have been killed, right? Terrorists, okay? And they're not terrorists, these people, because this dehumanizing, racist, bigoted language used towards Palestinians, that every single Palestinian who wants to resist an illegal occupation and under the Fourth Geneva Convention utilize their right to armed self-defense or in order to liberate their homeland is a terrorist, is ridiculous, and it paints them as irrational. But when they say that, they want to say we killed lots of terrorists, and they can provide the statistics. And even in election campaigns, the likes of Benny Gantz, who's now the Minister of War or Defense Minister, as they call him, there's not much defense about what they're doing here. They have the right to defend themselves. That's what we always hear. You don't defend yourself with precision weapons where you can see the soldiers a lot of the time who are firing these precision weapons. There's video cameras on some of these munitions, right? So they can see what they're hitting. They can cancel the munition up until the last second if they chose to do so, but they kill civilians and they don't give a damn, right? And this has been documented time and time again. And I'm 100% that this is happening now. And so when this happens, right, and more Israeli soldiers are killed or they're captured, they bring in all the firepower. Look, we leveled the houses of the terrorists. Look, we killed all the terrorists. Look, we killed 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. It doesn't matter how many they kill. They're all terrorists. That's how it will be portrayed. And then Israel can say, we won because look at the massive firepower. We restored our deterrence capacity, as they call it, which is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. And the people that believe this live in a freaking lunatic asylum. A lunatic asylum. And the people who are defending this right now, by the way, the people who are defending what Human Rights Watch calls an apartheid regime, in the future are going to bow their heads in shame and they're going to shut up and pretend like they didn't back it. That's what's going to happen. I can guarantee you that. In the future, that's going to be what takes place.
And the Human Rights Watch report came out like after decades of the apartheid happening, and it was pretty much just stating water is wet with what's going on there. I was showing clips the other day of a lot of Israelis that were celebrating and singing when there was burning happening outside of Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's really hard to be defending Israel's actions right now. Yet a lot of people are doing it because the U.S. and its Western mainstream media defend this stuff. They facilitate the defending of these colonialists. And then here we have the U.S. State Department spokesperson. I'm going to play this clip and then ask for your thoughts on it. Let me adjust the audio real quick for everybody. U.S. State Department spokesperson refuses to condemn Israel's killing of Palestinian children in Gaza, dodges question on Palestinians' rights to self-defense. Just 1 second. Just adjusting here. There we go.
We're speaking of the principle of self-defense.
I'm asking if you think that the principle of self-defense applies to the retaliatory, the airstrikes that they're conducting in response.
Matt, this is a very fluid situation. I would hesitate to comment on operations beyond, the rocket fire that is clearly targeting innocent civilians in Israel. So I would hesitate to speak to specific operations that have just occurred. But the broader principle of self-defense is something we stand by on behalf of Israel and every other country.
I want to ask you about East Jerusalem, but let's talk about what you said about the principle of self-defense. Does that in any way apply to the Palestinians? Do they have a right to self-defense? Do Palestinians have a right to self-defense?
In broadly speaking, Saeed, we believe in the concept of self-defense. We believe it applies to any state. I don't think that. I certainly wouldn't want my words to be construed as.
I understand. I want to ask you on Israel. I don't want to harp on this either, but the Israelis killed 13 people just now, including maybe 5 or 6 children. Do you condemn that? Do you condemn the killing of children?
Saeed,
I'm asking you, do you condemn the killing of Palestinian children?
Obviously, and these reports are just emerging, and I understand, I was just speaking to the team, I understand we don't have independent confirmation of facts on the ground yet, so I'm very hesitant to get into reports that are just emerging. Obviously, the deaths of civilians, be they Israeli or Palestinians, are something we would take very seriously.
Okay.
You're going to know as soon as I read what your answer was that there's a big problem with it. You said, well, not a problem, it just doesn't answer the question. We believe that it, meaning the right to self-defense, applies to any state. Well, you see the problem, right? Yes?
Do you want to?
Do you regard Palestine as a state?
I wasn't
Do you
referring.
think that, do you
But
don't in the context of the ICC and the UN. So are you saying that you do not, if it applies to any state, are you saying that Palestinians don't have a right to self-defense?
I was making a broader point, not attached to Israel or the Palestinians in that case.
So they do have a right to self-defense.
Matt, I'm not in a position to debate the legalities from up here. What our message is one of de-escalation.
All right, and then just from this,
Robert, you can hear the wiggling. He's trying to find logic in condemning Palestine, but defending what Israel is doing. What are your thoughts about this? This is representing the U.S. and again the State Department. What are your thoughts on this guy's response to the killing of children in Gaza?
Well, let's frame it this way. If someone was to get up there and say that white Americans have the right to self-defense and they're defending themselves, right? But black Americans don't have the right to self-defense, what would we call that? What would we call
A genocide.
I mean, yeah, it's you're justifying a genocide. One, people don't have the right to defend themselves. They don't have the right, no matter what they come under, they don't have the right to defend themselves. That's basically the position on the Palestinians. They cannot defend themselves. They're never defending themselves. And why? Because they are viewed as lesser than human beings. And when do these stories hit the mainstream press? They hit the mainstream press when Israel comes under attack, when Israel is getting the rocket attacks. And in the past, the rockets were akin to fireworks, the large majority of them. So when you view a situation like this, or when situation like this is presented in such a way, then there's one way we can analyze it. Israel and the United States are exactly the same in terms of the entity that they are. They're the same thing. And this goes for the rest of the Western countries. They're in one block of supremacy, of colonial supremacy. That's what they are, supremacists. And that's how they operate. No other people have rights. Only they have rights. And only their rights can be violated. So, for instance, when people in what's called the third world are violating international law, they should be prosecuted. There should be humanitarian interventions. But when people in the third world are being massacred, and when the West is committing the crimes, nothing to be said, or the allies of the West. So it's a horrendous double standard. But one thing that gives me a bit of hope is that this time, the social media reaction, what I've seen on social media, and even from celebrities and many different people, and a lot of people are getting engaged with this issue, and a lot of people are actually expressing their outrage at what's happening and their solidarity with Palestinians. Because I think people are sick and tired of this. It's the same line every time, and no matter what Israel does, the only thing they can say, Israel is defending itself, Hamas, 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 and anti-Semitism. And it's the same three things that they'll go on, and maybe they'll add in and throw in a few other things there. But it's the same responses. But how do you respond to that question? And credit to those journalists, they did their job, because they really, asked him questions which should have been asked. But, the problem is that the framing of this is never correct, even when we're looking at that. Yeah, hypocrisy. But this is just racism. That's what it is. This is bigotry. This is supremacy. That's what we're seeing here. Apartheid state is being supported. Apartheid. Like, you imagine today it would be unacceptable to say that it's for someone to stand up in a room or in public. If you just call out, I supported apartheid South Africa, eventually you're probably going to get somebody come and assault you,
It
right?
would look so foolish. These people
You'd
don't
look
realize that
ridiculous.
in the future they're going to look so foolish saying that they supported apartheid Israel.
Yep, exactly the same thing. And so I think the international solidarity is building. People are rightfully very upset about what's happening. And that offers some hope, as well as the Palestinians themselves this time are actually able to an extent, fight back, right? And they're doing as such, and they're united. And as long as they stay united, then at least they can try and do something back this time. At least they can try and prevent Israel or give Israel, for instance, a reason to think about committing crimes. So now what Israel is doing is it's going crazy because normally it can just commit whatever crime it wants against Palestinians and there's no repercussion. Now the Palestinians are giving them a solid response and they're going nuts. How can they respond to us? We just are able to do this. They feel so emboldened that they can do anything. And now they're so mad. And they don't understand why people don't support them. But it's obvious. It's obvious. No one supports this. If you know what is actually going on, if you've been there and seen it with your own eyes, like I have, for instance, there's no way you can support this. No one can. And there's no way you cannot. Nobody's immune to human emotion. If you're close to this issue, this is going to touch you. This is going to really hurt. Okay. And it does, honestly, this whole situation, it's horrendous. And the fact that the international community, and this has to be pointed out, the fact the international community has not utilized its power and put pressure on Israel in any meaningful way, no matter what Israel does, is the reason why armed resistance exists. Because the first course of action is the economic pressure and the pressure on Israel, the cutting off of ties with Israel. And you could bring them back into line. But no, the international community lets them go as far as they like anytime and commit any crimes. And it looks like now, finally, Israel's getting something back. And the international community, the West specifically, that's what we're really talking about when we talk about the international community, because they're the largest players here, right? The Western supremacist powers, they're now acting shocked because they caused this. The West caused this directly. It did not rein in its mad dog, and it gave its mad dog the ability to do this. It gave its mad dog the ability to go so far extreme to the right that now it's a place which is one of the nastiest places on earth. And it's despicable. And that's why we're seeing armed resistance, because the international community didn't uphold its laws and it threw them out the window. And it decided for itself, we don't care about the law. Well, if you don't care about the law and there's no one to uphold the law gets taken into its own hands. And we've seen this throughout history with national liberation causes. People will do this because when you're being killed and oppressed, are you supposed to just lie down and die and take it?
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. Exactly. How can I come up here and knowing international law, how can I come into a public sphere and say that Palestinians are obligated to lay down and die, lay down and take apartheid, lay down and take the conditions under which they live? I'm not going to say that. I refuse to.
And is that what they expected, for them to just lie down and not do anything? Like, hey, peaceful, anything peaceful, like any resistance that they do, peaceful or not, Israel's going to respond violently. And so what do you expect them to do? What do you like? And then the international community, like you mentioned, are just like, hey, don't do that. That's bad. Hey, that's bad. That's bad. It's not even like a slap on the wrist. It's just like, hey, I'm warning you. Hey, I'm warning you again. Hey, that's not good. And then this is what it leads to. This is what it leads to. So now the U.S. and all these other Western countries are reacting like that Pikachu meme, like with the surprised face, like, oh my God, I didn't know this was going to happen. So my last question to you, because I know you're dealing with a lot and you have a lot going on today, is where do you see this going, and what are your thoughts on like a two-state solution versus a one-state solution?
Two-state solution is completely dead. No Israeli government. I mean, look how extreme they've been acting lately, and how extreme right wing Netanyahu has taken, the regime. So the two-state solution is something of the past. The international consensus is still based upon a two-state solution. So they still agree with that, but again, they have done nothing to achieve it, and that's why it's died, because they don't care about Palestinians. It's not a big issue for them, right? Because in my opinion, it's just racism. It's bigotry. But the one-state solution, where it's one state between the river and the sea, and all people, no matter what their religion or ethnicity, have the same citizenship, are governed under the same laws, and all have the rights to vote, right? And all have equal human rights. That is the solution. That's the real solution. And there's 50-50 roughly Palestinians and Israelis between the river and the sea, right? And Israeli Jews between the river and the sea, because when I'm saying Palestinians, I am including the Palestinians with Israeli citizenships. And also we have the diaspora community too. So regardless of what they paint it as, because I'll say this is an obliteration of Israel and this is about a new genocide. No, what I am saying is that you should not have an ethno-supremacist regime which runs an apartheid regime. I don't believe in that. I believe that if you have a state, it should be for all people, regardless of what you're identifying as or what your ethnic background is, your culture is. It should be shared with everyone. And this is a universal value. We could not take the Israel-Palestine question and put it in any other country and start painting it the same way. Oh, do you think African Americans should not have full rights because it corrupts the nature of white America? That's a ridiculous statement. That's a racist statement. So put that back in Palestine. That's the exact same thing. Palestinians shouldn't have human rights because it corrupts the Jewish nature of Israel. Well, it's the exact same thing, isn't it? We're just changing the place. So there should be a one-state solution, all people with equal rights. And unfortunately, the international community is not behind it at the moment. In order for instance, a two-state solution to become a reality, even though personally I don't believe in it as a solution, in order for that to become a reality, there has to be pressure put on Israel, and Israel has to be reined in. Israel has to basically be put in its place. And I don't see that happening from the international community unless the United States becomes so embarrassed of Israel, and Israel really is hurt militarily by the resistance. And if other countries get involved, which I'm not too hopeful that they will, but if, for instance, Lebanon gets involved in this, we've seen rocket fire from inside Lebanon today from some random group of people who were arrested, not Hezbollah. But if they are to get involved, then this may turn into a situation where the international community will have to get involved to save Israel. Because Israel, this is putting them under real threat. This is a huge threat to them, what's happening, the Palestinians. And that's what happens when you treat 50% of the people in the land that you control like dirt. Mm-hmm. You're going to have a real problem. And they're having that problem. And for the first time, it's a real threat. And you got the ICC investigation pending. You got these human rights reports coming out exposing what they're doing. So I believe that the situation, if it continues like it is, Israel is going to massacre more Palestinians. I cannot predict how many they will kill. And there's a number of scenarios that can play out. If foreign countries, like if, for instance, something is done from Syria, something's done from Lebanon, something's done from Yemen or Iran or Iraq, it could dramatically change things. But I don't have full faith that it's going to happen. Perhaps it will. Perhaps most likely it would be from Yemen and from Lebanon, in my opinion. But yeah, there's a number of ways this can go at this point. But, we're going to witness the massacre of many more Palestinians. And unfortunately, the world has left them to die, and the region has left them to die. And they're doing this on their own, and they're fighting as well as they possibly can, and doing everything they can. And this is just collective outrage of people who live under oppression. This is what happens. And then you'll have the people that come in and they say, oh, you condone the violence of this, blah, blah, blah. You condone this act, or you condone this act, right? This morally reprehensible act was committed on this occasion. I understand why they are reacting like this. And if you can't understand how this got to this point, you're not looking at it properly. You're really not. You're not. The South African people rose up, right? And do you think they weren't doing bomb attacks? Why was Nelson Mandela in prison? Why was he in prison? What happened in Algeria? Do you think that was just all sunshine and rainbows? No. People's perception of this is just thrown all down. They try and explain it away. They try and accuse you of whatever they can accuse you of. And at the end of the day, it's about human rights, and it's about creating equality, and it's about stopping apartheid. And that's it. That's it. Nothing else. And we want every single person, all of our brothers and sisters, to be equal. That's all we want.
Robert Inlakesh of The Last American Vagabond and Press TV. Thank you for being here. Again, people, check out his documentary series on his channel. It's called The Steal of the Century. And to the audience members, keep calling out the bullshitters like Andrew Yang, Gal Gadot, and AOC, who's being a hypocrite because she doesn't want to call out Nancy Pelosi, who's supporting this. Keep calling them out. I'm really proud to see a lot of people calling out these bullshitters that are not seeing things for how they really are. Free Palestine. And again, Robert, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.